Right. Okay. Thanks. Thanks. Thanks for putting together this meeting. So I'll present some work that is set in the oceanographic context. This is work that was done with the former student here, Madhava, who visited ICTS and worked with me for a year, and wrote this paper explaining how passive tracers are getting stirred in the ocean. Right. So I realized over the past few days that there isn't much understanding amongst the participants about ocean or turbulence in general. So I've dedicated a first few slides for general intro. So the oceans are one of the components in the Earth system. So we have the oceans, land, atmosphere, and all these are part of the climate system. And when you compare the atmosphere and the ocean is relatively slow. So when you look at carbon dioxide getting dissolved in the oceans, or heat exchange happening between the atmosphere and the oceans are relatively slower to respond than the atmosphere, and this makes it a little more challenging to resolve and parameterize it in climate scale models. So understanding the ocean and its dynamics is important for our overall improvement of climate scale models that run on very long time scales. So here is a satellite image of chlorophyll content in the ocean, and we are looking at a big vortex here. So we'll see a lot of these vortices as this talk goes on. This is a big vortex which has a diameter of close to 100 kilometers, and then you see smaller vortices and thin filaments in this flow. So this is what makes the flows in the ocean. It is a mixture of these big vortices stretching across many scales. So these are the equations one would look at for oceanic and atmospheric flows. They're called the Boussinesq equations. So earlier in this meeting, first couple of talks, we saw Navier-Stokes equations. So the first set of equations describes evolution of velocity. So V is the velocity in x, y, and z direction. This is a Coriolis term, which is important because we are looking at motions at the order of 50 to 100 kilometer scale. So at these scales, the Coriolis force becomes important. And then we have this extra variable, which is buoyancy. So buoyancy is the term that contains information about density, temperature, and so on. So in addition to velocity, we are also looking at buoyancy, and this coupled system is called the Boussinesq set of equations. And an important non-dimensional parameter that appears in the system is called the Rossby number. So Rossby number tells us how significant the vorticity of the flow is compared to the external rotation rate. So here F is the Coriolis rotation frequency, and zeta is the vorticity of the fluid. So this parameter, Rossby number, tells us how important the Coriolis term is. So it's really ratio of these two terms. This is the advective nonlinearity, and this is the Coriolis force. So the ratio of this is roughly Rossby number. And Rossby number varies across scales. So when you're at 100 kilometer scales in the ocean, these scales are called mesoscales. Rossby number is asymptotically small. It's really small at these scales. But as you go to smaller scales, we'll see in this talk, these scales are called submesoscales. So at scales of the order of 10 kilometer and below, Rossby number reaches order 1 values. So Rossby number, this non-dimensional number, undergoes the transition from asymptotically small values at 100 kilometer and all to order 1 values as you go to 10 kilometer and below. So here are a couple of slides on turbulence in general. So if you sit in a class in fluid dynamics and turbulence, you learn that in 3-dimensional flows, we have this concept of forward energy cascade. So the idea is that you have big vortices. So the schematic shows different scales of vortices. So you have really big vortices, which breaks up into smaller and smaller vortices. And this process, which resembles a waterfall going across many staircase levels, is called a cascade. So this is called a forward energy cascade, where energy is going from big vortices step by step to smaller and smaller vortices. So this is the forward energy cascade. And this is a prominent turbulent energy transfer in 3-dimensional turbulence. Now, when you look at 2-dimensional turbulence, so before that, okay, here's a movie that shows 3D turbulence. So this is what is called a turbulent jet. So on the left-hand end, we have a jet coming in that is injecting vortices that are the size of this jet. And as you go downstream, you see this big vortex pair breaking up and forming smaller scales, which gradually fade downstream. So you can see in the color bar, bright is white, it's maximum here. And as you go downstream, these vortices get smaller, they break, and they're getting dissipated by viscous action. So this is a It's from a numerical simulation of this turbulent jet, and it's illustrating this forward energy cascade process, where energy is going from big vortices to smaller and smaller vortices, and eventually it gets dissipated at the viscous scale, or also called the Kolmogorov scale. So that's the forward energy cascade. So this is what you expect in three-dimensional turbulence. But when you go to two-dimensional turbulence, you have extra conserved quantities. So in 3D turbulence, we have conservation of energy. Energy is the only thing that's conserved in 3D turbulence. But when you go to 2D turbulence, you have conservation of energy and entropy. So entropy is vorticity squared. Theta here is the vorticity of the fluid. That's squared integrated over the domain. So this is entropy. And so you have two conservation laws. Both of these are integral conservation conserved quantities. And because of these two, so these two conserved laws now constrain the system. And now in this system, we see what is called an inverse energy cascade. Energy goes from smaller scales to larger scales as time evolves. So here you have really small vortices, and they get bigger and bigger with time, and they form bigger and bigger vortices. So this is an illustration of that in, again, with a numerical simulation of 2D Euler equations. So the initial condition here is what is called white noise. On every grid point, I have a random number. And then when I evolve this, you'll see vortices forming spontaneously, and they interact, they merge, and they get bigger with time. So if you run this long, you'll end up with one or two really big vortices of opposite sign. So that's the inverse energy cascade, which is what you see in two-dimensional turbulence. Energy goes from smaller scales gradually to larger scales. Right? So now getting back to, so there was a preview on turbulence in different dimensions. Now when you look back at the ocean, flows in the ocean has a mix of both of these. It has the inverse and forward energy cascade. As we saw earlier, the mesoscale flows. So mesoscale flows are at the order of 100 kilometer scales. At these scales, Rossby number is small. So at these scales, the Coriolis term is very strong. So the flow is strongly constrained by rotation effects, and that makes Rossby number small. And because of that, we have an inverse energy cascade. Energy goes from smaller vortices to bigger and bigger vortices. So that's what you see at mesoscales or at 100 kilometer scales. Now, as you go to submesoscales, which are at the order of 10 kilometers and smaller, the effect of Coriolis term becomes weaker. So now rotation has less significance than mesoscales. Rossby number approaches order 1 values, and the flow takes more three-dimensional character. So now energy goes from bigger vortices to smaller vortices, as you see here. So this transition is what is seen in the ocean as you go from large 100 kilometer scales to small scales of the order of 10 kilometers and smaller. So turbulent dynamics completely changes. And in this talk, we'll look at how passive tracers such as carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and all of these, how these are influenced by this transition in the flow dynamics. So this is a movie that's showing us the flow in the ocean from a global scale ocean model simulation that was run a while ago. We're looking at surface speed here. So plotted variable is surface speed. And when I run this, you'll see a lot of vortices here. So you can see these bigger vortices which are interacting. And then there are a lot of these fast fluctuations. So in this particular region, this fast fluctuation is due to internal tides in this coastal region. And then on this side, you see again a lot of vortices. You see smaller vortices, and then a lot of these filaments due to vortex interaction and so on. So when you look at flows in the ocean, it's really multi-scale and turbulent in nature. It has all these broad set of scales interacting and exchanging energy. And so that sort of shows you the challenge in resolving a lot of these finer scales in large ocean models and climate scale models. So now we get to this topic of this talk, passive tracers. So tracers, there are many tracers in the ocean. So heat, salt, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, all these are tracers. So they're called tracers because these, you would call something a passive tracer if this tracer doesn't directly affect the flow. So carbon dioxide, for example, it's a gas, it's affected by the flow, but it doesn't directly affect the flow. So it's a one-way coupling. And see, these kind of passive tracers are modeled by advection diffusion equations, such as the one I've written here. So theta here is a passive tracer. V is the oceanic flow velocity that's advecting or moving the tracer around. And this is the diffusive term that is acting to dissipate tracer field reaching Kolmogorov scale or viscous scale. So that's a simple advection diffusion equation. And it's really a linear equation if you know V. So in a lot of these cases, we know the velocity by solving the Boussinesq or Navier-Stokes equation. So the velocity field is known. And if velocity is known, this is a linear partial differential equation. And then when you look at these large-scale ocean model outputs and observation, what you see is that because the flow itself is very turbulent and its nature changes across scales, the characteristic features of tracer dispersion also changes across scales. And that means that the dispersion of tracer at 100-kilometer scale is different from what you would see at 10-kilometer scale or 1-kilometer scale. So at every different scale, the tracer dynamics are going to be very different. And so this line sort of expresses a challenge in climate scale models in general. This is a very major concern. So the idea is that if you integrate an equation like this in a climate scale model, alpha here is the diffusivity of the tracer. So if you resolve the tracer and the flow up to Kolmogorov or viscous scale, then alpha would be a constant, the constant being set by molecular constraints. So molecular dynamics and all will tell us carbon dioxide, for example, has a diffusivity that is set by properties of carbon dioxide. But if you do not resolve all the scales up to the viscous scale, then alpha cannot be constant. So for example, if in my model, if I'm resolving only up to 10-kilometer scales, suppose my model has a resolution that I resolve only up to 10 or 1-kilometer scales, then my alpha has to change according to the scale. So alpha is no longer constant. Somehow we have to take into effect the dynamics of the flow and parameterize alpha appropriately. So this is a challenge in a lot of these climate scale models, because when people who run these climate scale models, what they find is that if you change alpha slightly, it can change a lot of things. For example, if you change alpha a little, that will change the ocean circulation quite a bit. The major currents in the ocean can get adjusted when you change alpha. And ocean's uptake of carbon dioxide getting dissolved, all these are sensitive to what value of alpha you prescribe in the equation. So this is the challenge from a large-scale model perspective. It's not obvious what alpha should be or how alpha should change as a function of scale when you have models that are not perfect, that resolve scales only up to a certain extent and do not resolve all the scales that go up to Kolmogorov scale. So we're trying to understand within an idealized setting how some of these tracer dispersion characteristics change as we go from small Rossby mesoscales to Rossby order 1 submesoscales. So we'll look at this with a model. So this is a model that can generate both mesoscale and submesoscale like flows. So we get this model by projecting the Boussinesq equations. So earlier in this talk, you saw the Boussinesq equations. So if you take the Boussinesq equations and project them on two Fourier modes in the vertical direction. So I'm projecting them on the zeroth Fourier mode in the vertical direction and a particular Fourier mode in the vertical direction that represents the dominant variability. So we're projecting all the variables on two modes, and that gives us a set of equations that are written out here. So we don't need all the details of the equation, but I've sketched a schematic here. This is how the model looks. So we have two vertical modes. Both of them have horizontal structure. So the first mode is called the barotropic. Barotropic refers to the flow that has no vertical content or no vertical structure. And then we have what is called a baroclinic mode, which contains all the vertical variability. So this is the flow setup. And if you, so the advantage of these equations that this is a set of equations that has Rossby number, the non-dimensional number appearing explicitly in the equation. So if I take off Rossby number and if I remove this particular mode, I would get 2D Euler equations, which is a special case of this. So this is a model that can capture both 2D turbulence and part of 3D turbulence that you see in submesoscale field. So this is an illustration of the flows this model can generate. We are looking at these two flow components here on left and right in the two columns. And Rossby number is increasing from top to bottom. So this is the lowest Rossby number flow. So this looks more like 2D turbulence, what we saw earlier in this talk. You get big vortices forming. But as you go to higher Rossby number, so Rossby number is increasing from top to bottom, you get a lot of these smaller scale structures that are formed by vortices breaking. So when you look at high Rossby numbers, you see that we have fewer number of vortices compared to low Rossby number, fewer vortices, and you see that the flow is dominated by positive red vortices. Negative vortices, you see a lot of negative vortices at low Rossby number. They've all broken up into small background soup at these high Rossby numbers. So this is a feature that is often seen in sub-mesoscale flows. So these flows are more like mesoscale, and these flows are more like sub-mesoscales. So this is a turbulent transition you see in many complex ocean models and observations. And this is a model that can capture the important features of those flows across Rossby numbers. And now we are looking at how a tracer gets dispersed by these different flows. So this is the passive tracer equation that we looked at earlier. So this left column is again the flow that we saw on the previous slide. And on here, we are looking at the passive tracer field. Right? So what you observe is that at low Rossby numbers, we have this passive tracer has larger scale structures that are trapped in these vortices. So wherever you see a coherent vortex, you'll see corresponding tracer patches here. But as you go to higher Rossby numbers, you see there's more stirring of the tracer field by these high energy small scale flows. So if you look from top to bottom on the right column, you'll see that the tracer is trapped in these vortices here. But as you go to high Rossby number, there's a lot more stirring and dispersion of the tracer field by the flow at high Rossby numbers. And these are plots that show how energy and tracer field is distributed across big numbers of scales. So when you look at the flow energy, this is the energy spectrum. So here, red curve is the sub-mesoscale flow, this one. So this is a shallower spectra, which is telling us that it has more energy at small scales, concomitant with what you see here. And correspondingly, when you look at the tracer spectrum, so this red curve is the tracer spectrum that corresponds to this setup. We see that there's a lot more depletion of the tracer field in this part of the inertial range compared to lower Rossby number flow. So this tracer is getting stirred more and more by these high Rossby flows that they're getting depleted across scales as you increase Rossby number. So increasing Rossby number makes tracer stirring more efficient and depletes them from across scales. And now this is showing us what is called the tracer flux. So what you do is you go back to the tracer equation and you write down an equation for the evolution of the tracer variance. So this theta k square, this is a tracer variance contained in a wave number k. So you sum it over a band of wave numbers. This tells us the rate at which the tracer field contained in a band of wave numbers is getting expelled to smaller scales. So that's the tracer flux. So pi is the tracer flux in wave number space, and here I'm plotting the flux across different wave numbers for different Rossby numbers. So for the lowest Rossby number case, which is here, this tracer flux is relatively low, but as you increase Rossby number and get to flows like this, we get a much stronger flux, again indicating that this tracer is getting expelled to smaller scales much more rapidly by these sub-mesoscale rich flows. So now we'll look at some of the features of this tracer flux in physical space. So with some manipulations, we can write down some. In the previous slides, we saw the tracer flux across wave numbers. So now with some manipulation, I can write down the tracer flux in physical space. So this is a representation of the tracer flux in physical space. And looking at it, I know which are the locations where the tracer is going to smaller scales. So red here represents positive. So at those locations, tracer is going down to smaller scales. And then blue regions, which also are present here, are regions where tracer is going up. So this tracer flux tells us or gives us an indication of which are the important regions where the tracer stirring and dispersion is very high, right? And then once you have this tracer flux, you can plot this tracer flux as a function of vorticity. So this is a plot that's showing us the tracer flux mapped against normalized vorticity, and it's a cumulative sum. So tracer flux is quickly going to 1. But the important observation here is that most of the tracer flux is located in regions where the vorticity is low. So low vorticity regions contain a major share of the tracer downscale flux. So once you have a matrix like this, you can go back and look at your physical space vorticity field and ask, what are the regions that contain most of the tracer flux? So here I'm showing two vorticity fields. This is the low Rossby mesoscale-like flow, and this is a high Rossby sub-mesoscale-like flow. So this is a full vorticity field, and this is showing us regions that contain, vorticity regions that contain 90% of the tracer flux. So green regions are regions that are being set to 0. We can ignore them. But the remaining regions, red and blue regions, these are the regions that contain most of the tracer flux. So you'll notice that the core of these vortices, so all these vortex cores, the cores are green, which means they're not contributing much. Most of the tracer flux is located in regions outside the core of these vortices. So that's the main finding here. And we see something similar here at higher Rossby numbers. As you go to Rossby order 1, you'll see that there are a lot of these regions which are green. So green regions correspond to these small coherent vortices. Rest of the regions are regions that contain 90% of the tracer flux. So most of the flux is in these fine scale structures. So these structures are responsible for stirring and transferring this tracer to smaller scales. So now we'll look at one further decomposition that tells us a little more about the tracer flux locations. So this is a flow decomposition that is popular. It's called the Okubo-Weiss criterion. So this is how the Okubo-Weiss criterion works. So you have vorticity. So this is a fluid vorticity. And then you can form this variable called strain or strain rate. So strain rate is computed from derivatives of velocity. So once you have vorticity and strain rate, you can compute two kinds of flow regions. So this is useful for splitting the flow region into two separate parts. You can form strain dominant regions where the strain rate is higher than vorticity, and then you have vorticity dominant regions where vorticity is higher than strain. So once you apply this filter constraint, you have split the domain into or the field into two different parts, vorticity dominant and strain dominant region. So these are pictures showing us how these different regions look. So this is a low Rossby case. So for the low Rossby case, this is a vorticity field and this is strain or strain rate. And this is showing us strain dominant region. So again, green refers to regions that are be ignored. So the remaining regions, you'll notice the remaining regions are regions that are in between vortices. So these regions that lie between vortices, those are regions that are strain dominant regions. Whereas when you look at vorticity dominant regions, these are mostly the coherent vortices. So this is one thing that makes the Okubo-Weiss criterion very popular in fluid dynamics, because it helps you to isolate these coherent vortices. You look for vorticity dominant regions, and these vorticity dominant regions are these coherent vortices that you see in the flow, whereas strain dominant regions are regions that lie between the coherent vortices. So you succeed in splitting the flow into these two disjoint components. So this is for low Rossby number. When you look at higher Rossby number, this is vorticity field strain, and the strain dominant region is marked here, and this is the vorticity dominant region. So the highlighted high Rossby numbers or sub-mesoscales is that vorticity dominant region now has two kinds of structures. What they're highlighted in these black boxes here. Vorticity dominant regions have these coherent structures. So I marked one of them here. These are small coherent structures. And additionally, it has a lot of these fragmented pieces of vortices that are forming in this flow. So both these are vorticity dominant region. You have these coherent structures and these small broken pieces of vortices which float in the flow. Whereas at low Rossby numbers, we don't see such small scale structures. So now, I guess the last part of the talk is pointing out that the tracer concentration, the concentration of the tracer and the tracer flux, we can look at how these two change across Rossby numbers in these different regions, vorticity dominant and strain dominant. So when you look at this, what you find is that at low Rossby numbers, most of the tracer field is contained in the vorticity dominant region. So if you remember the earlier plots that I showed, remember the tracer was stuck inside coherent structures. So that's the sign that we see again here. Most of the tracer variance is contained in vorticity dominant regions at low Rossby numbers, and correspondingly, the tracer flux is high at low Rossby numbers in strain dominant regions. So stirring at low Rossby numbers happens between coherent structures, whereas as you go to higher Rossby numbers, what we find is that a tracer flux becomes dominant at the strain dominant regions, and strain dominant regions contain a lot of these tracer variance also. So this also undergoes a transition as you go from low Rossby number to high Rossby number. Regions that contain the tracer field and the tracer flux changes as we increase Rossby number. So there's a major transition. In the earlier part of the talk, I said there's a transition in the flow as you go from mesoscale, low Rossby to high Rossby sub-mesoscales. We see a similar transition as you go from low Rossby number to high Rossby number for all the tracer dispersion characteristics. Okay, so that sort of ends the talk. So major goal of this work was to look at this tracer dispersion equation and check how the turbulent dynamics of the tracer field changes as you go from low Rossby mesoscale to high Rossby submesoscale. And what we see is that the tracer flux etc. increases monotonically as you go to high Rossby numbers. Most of the tracer flux is located in regions where the flow is relatively weak. And one of the most important findings is that when you look at ocean models, etc., typically, as I explained earlier in this talk, alpha, the diffusivity is put in as a constant or something that varies geographically. But what we show is that the tracer dispersion changes a lot. Remember the tracer flux distribution in physical space. All these are highly anisotropic. So we can't put in an alpha that's a constant or changes just geographically. This alpha has to depend somehow on Rossby number so that it factors in the scale dependent features of the tracer dispersion. So this is something, this is again part of many other studies that tries to understand how the tracer dispersion has to be modified when you put it in large scale ocean and climate models. So I'll stop there. Yeah, so the diffusion.
You have got the dispersion.
Right. So the diffusion coefficient would be proportional to this flux. So that would be the simplest way to parameterize this. You would just say alpha is a constant times this flux in the inertial range. And that would tell us that it's increasing by a couple of orders of magnitude as you go across scales.
So is there any difference diffusive behavior, subdiffusive behavior, superdiffusive? Those regimes, are they separated like that?
There are. So we would see them better if you put in, say, for example, particles. But there are these regimes as you go from, so if you go to low Rossby flows, flows like these would trap particles and this would be subdiffusive, whereas these would be superdiffusive. So there is a, yes.
Model of, little ducks.
Right.
Which reached various places.
Right.
Must have seen that.
Yes, yes. Well, so the duck data is quite sparse actually too, because we're looking at finer scales here. So see, the ducks would span. Right. So they span many of these, whereas here we are looking. So you see, in reality, this would be of a few kilometers, whereas this would be like 100 kilometers. So the ducks are spanning this sort of a domain, but we don't get much data from that experiment to look at these kind of flows.
Rama was talking of voids. Does it make sense to talk about voids?
That I'll have to think about it. I'm not sure. That I'm not sure. Yes.
Ocean flows, basically. Have you ever tried those?
Yeah. Well, so there are many methods to split and identify coherent vortices. This is the cheapest method, Okubo-wise, because it uses just the Eulerian flow. The other ones, you require particles, Lagrangian. So when you look at some of these results, what you see is that some of those methods would get a little more. So if you what is a coherent vortex? And that the precise definition changes depending on the method you use. So Okubo-wise gives us structures like this. If you use the Lagrangian method, there are these finite time Lyapunov exponent based methods, you would get some more structures that have relatively less energy, but they would add to this. So you would get a little more structure. But it's hard to say how much they would change the predictions without actually trying them. There are several, yes. Yes, yeah. They're called Lagrangian coherent structures. Yeah, I know this. So, but when you look at different kind of geophysical turbulence studies that compare these, the extra stuff that you get than Okubo-wise is relatively less. So you don't get an order one change or extra benefit by applying them.
the Lagrangian coefficient structures context, sometimes you get unstable with symmetry.
Right. Yes. No, we don't get them here. No. Yes, correct.